"You can take the guest room or move out," Mom said when my sister suddenly moved in with her husband. "Better if you're gone by tomorrow," my sister added cheerfully. I moved out. A week later, panic set in. The heat of Tampa pressed through the walls like punishment. That afternoon, I stood at the foot of the stairs, watching Brooke's designer luggage gleam beneath the ceiling fan. Her laughter filled the hallway, a sound that once meant home but now carved through me like a blade. Mom's voice echoed from the kitchen, practical, unwavering, final. There was no room left for negotiation, only obedience dressed as reason. I tried to breathe, but the air felt heavier than it should. "My name is Tessa Ward, 24, the daughter who stayed. The one who worked quietly, saved money, and believed loyalty would matter. But loyalty never wins in this house. Perfection does, and perfection has always looked like my sister." The guest room smelled like paint and regret. Its narrow window faced the neighbor's fence, not the ocean view I'd grown up with. Mom said it was temporary, but her eyes said permanent. I folded the blanket on the bed and realized I couldn't live in a space built for waiting, not anymore. When night came, the cicadas screamed against the heat. I packed everything that still felt like mine: camera, laptop, sketchbook, and left the rest behind. The key made a sharp sound when I dropped it on the counter, a sound that felt like truth. Outside, the streetlights flickered over the palm trees, and for the first time in years, I felt both homeless and free. The world wasn't kind, but neither was home, and maybe leaving was the first act of revenge I didn't know I was ready to take. The morning after I left, the air smelled like salt and freedom. It wasn't peace exactly, more like standing on the edge of something that could collapse or become a miracle. Jamie Lynn's apartment was small, 2 rooms stacked above a thrift store, but it had space to breathe. She handed me the spare key without asking questions. That silence was its own kind of mercy. For the first time in years, I woke without the sound of my mother's footsteps, without Brooke's voice claiming every room as if her presence was oxygen. The quiet was loud but gentle, a reminder that emptiness can sometimes be the cleanest beginning. I built my new days from fragments. Morning runs by the bay, coffee so cheap it tasted like paper, emails to strangers offering my design work for half its worth. The world didn't owe me comfort, so I stopped asking for it. Tampa's sun was relentless, but it kept me moving. Sweat became proof that I still existed. A week later, I landed a junior position at a design studio downtown. The manager, Miss Carter, studied my portfolio with the same precision surgeons reserve for scalpels. She nodded once, and something inside me steadied. It wasn't praise, it was permission to start over. Each day bled into the next: commutes, deadlines, grocery lists scrawled on napkins. But somewhere between exhaustion and caffeine, I found rhythm. Jamie cheered for every small victory, every paycheck that didn't vanish overnight. She called it progress. I called it survival dressed in soft colors. At night, I edited photos for a cafe owner who couldn't afford a marketing team. The smell of roasted beans mixed with hope as I watched strangers smile at the pictures I took. They didn't know the photographer slept on a couch with borrowed sheets. They didn't have to. Bills were paid, one by one. I started to feel like maybe I wasn't the failure my family believed. Sometimes I imagined Brooke scrolling through social media, posting filtered happiness to cover the cracks she refused to admit. I didn't miss her, but I wondered if she ever thought about how easily she'd replaced me in Mom's eyes. Still, the freedom had a price. Loneliness crept in like humidity, invisible but heavy. I filled the silence with work, deadlines, playlists that drowned out the echo of old guilt. Success didn't feel like joy yet, only like motion. Then one afternoon, while sketching wireframes at my desk, an alert blinked on my phone. I almost ignored it, but the subject line froze me. Department of Labor opens investigation into Ward Logistics. My father's company. My chest tightened, not from surprise, but from the certainty that storms have long memories. I stared at the headline until the words blurred into static. The article was brief allegations of unpaid overtime, safety failures, ongoing inquiry. No names mentioned, but everyone in Tampa knew whose trucks wore the Ward logo. I closed the tab, hands shaking. This was the kind of news that could turn my family's name into a headline, the kind that makes neighbors whisper and reporters wait outside driveways. I thought about Mom's perfect lawn, about Brooke's smug certainty that our family's reputation was bulletproof. Part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to cry. But mostly, I just felt tired because even when you leave, the past finds ways to drag its feet into your new life. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't call anyone. I simply stared at the light filtering through the blinds, realizing that peace is fragile, and silence never lasts. And deep down, beneath the calm I'd built from ashes, something restless stirred an instinct that this wasn't over, not yet. Rumors have a way of moving faster than truth, especially in small cities pretending to be big. The investigation into Ward Logistics spread like smoke. No one saw the spark, but everyone smelled the fire. By the time I reached the studio that morning, the headlines were impossible to ignore. Every local outlet carried the same words: unpaid wages, safety violations, an anonymous source. I didn't read further. I didn't have to. The company name was enough to feel the old shame crawl up my spine. Victor Ward, my father, had built that empire out of sweat and ambition. He had once called it our family's pride. Now it was a public scandal, and pride was just another word people whispered before saying fraud. By noon, messages started appearing, unread numbers lighting up my phone like small alarms. I didn't open them. The silence between me and my family had been peaceful. I wasn't ready to surrender it to blame. But peace has a short lifespan when guilt is shared. At 4 p.m., the first blow landed. Mom's text arrived, long and trembling. "Tell me you didn't do this. Please, Tessa. Your father is devastated." For a long time, I just stared at the screen. There was no accusation sharper than doubt from the one who taught you kindness. I wanted to remind her that I hadn't lived under their roof for weeks, that my focus was survival, not sabotage. But explanations feel cheap when hearts have already chosen their villains. An hour later, the news broke wider. Ward Logistics' office downtown had been temporarily closed for audit. Cameras captured my family's logo against flashing police lights. The footage replayed on social media until even my co-workers at the studio watched it in stunned silence. Miss Carter said nothing, but I saw the careful sympathy in her glance. It was the look people give you when they think they understand, but don't want to say they do. Then came Brooke's message, colder, cleaner, merciless. "You wanted revenge, didn't you? Congratulations." No punctuation, no warmth, just a sentence meant to break skin. I wanted to throw my phone, but instead, I locked it in a drawer and kept designing. The screen in front of me blurred until the wireframes turned into meaningless shapes. Work was supposed to be my anchor, but the noise outside kept finding cracks in my calm. That night, the streets buzzed with talk. Tampa was small enough for gossip to feel personal. At the cafe where I freelanced, customers whispered about the construction mogul who cut corners. They didn't know I was his daughter. I pressed my earphones deeper, pretending I was somewhere else, someone else. When I finally got home, Jamie was waiting, concern drawn across her face. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The news had already answered everything she could have said. Her quiet presence filled the room better than comfort ever could. I lay awake long after midnight, scrolling through old family photos I'd promised never to look at again. In every picture, Brooke smiled like she'd been told to. Mom's hand rested perfectly on Dad's shoulder, and I was somewhere at the edge, always the extra piece that didn't fit the frame. The next morning, I opened my inbox to find a flood of new headlines. The Department of Labor had confirmed active investigation. Federal auditors were arriving within days. There was mention of missing safety reports, falsified payroll, and anonymous digital evidence. Anonymous. Such a heavy word when everyone in my family suddenly decided it meant me. By afternoon, Mom called again. I didn't answer. I couldn't bear to hear her voice break while asking if her own daughter had destroyed her husband's name. Instead, I turned off my phone and buried myself in work. The silence this time was not peace, it was defense. 3 days later, the story took a darker turn. Ward Logistics' main warehouse had been evacuated after a reported accident. I found out through a headline again: local business owner hospitalized after workplace incident. The name beneath it was my father's. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Every resentment I'd carried turned into confusion, then guilt. I didn't wish him harm, no matter what he'd done, but fate doesn't check intentions before striking. As the sun sank over Tampa Bay that evening, I realized the distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore, it was irreversible. My family's empire was crumbling, and I was watching from the outside, powerless, unwanted, and somehow still the one they blamed. The world can burn quietly, without sound, and sometimes the loudest thing left is your own heartbeat reminding you that survival isn't always clean. The world didn't slow down after the headlines. It only got quieter in the worst way. People stopped asking questions because they thought they already knew the answers. Guilt had a strange gravity, it pulled my name into every rumor, even when I stood miles away from the wreckage. 3 nights after the accident, I sat by the window of Jamie's apartment, watching lightning crawl over the bay. The city breathed humidity and secrets. My phone buzzed once, a message from Jamie. You need to see this. She arrived minutes later, hair damp from the rain, holding her laptop like it contained a ghost. The screen glowed between us, showing grainy footage from a doorbell camera belonging to a neighbor of my parents. The video timestamp hit me first late at night, weeks before the investigation broke. In the frame, Brooke stepped into view. She wasn't visiting, she was sneaking. Her silhouette moved across the porch, unlocking Dad's office door, a folder pressed to her chest. The camera caught her face when the motion light flicked on, focused, nervous, deliberate. Jamie's voice cut through the static of the recording, calm but firm. There's more. She opened another window, revealing a digital trail. Email logs traced to Nathan Ellis, my brother-in-law's laptop, used from the same Wi-Fi as my parents' house. Files attached. Sent to a local journalist. I felt my chest tighten, not from shock but from recognition. Brooke had always been good at pretending. I used to admire that talent. Now it looked like a weapon polished to perfection. My mind raced through possibilities. I could confront her, expose her, watch everything collapse with one click. But revenge had already ruined enough of us. I needed to think cold, clean, strategic. I copied the footage and logs onto a flash drive, labeling it simply, proof. Not justice, proof. They weren't the same thing. Jamie leaned against the counter, watching me quietly. There was no need for words. In that silence, I realized she trusted me not to act out of rage, maybe because she'd seen me do that before. Maybe because she knew how much restraint costs when betrayal wears your family's face. Days passed in slow motion. I went to work, smiled when needed, finished projects no one would remember. The investigation deepened. My mother stopped calling. Her silence said everything. Brooke's curated life online remained spotless, filtered vacations, dinner plates, smiling photos beside Nathan, though the comments were full of speculation. Then one evening, Jamie forwarded an email from a colleague who worked at a security firm. The subject line read, IP address verification. It confirmed what we already knew. Files leaked to the press had originated from the Ward residence, logged under Brooke's credentials. Facts, not feelings. I thought I'd feel vindicated. Instead, I just felt empty. Truth doesn't heal when there's no one willing to believe it. The next morning, Nathan moved out. His social media disappeared within hours. His office notified HR he'd taken an extended leave. Rumor had it he'd rented a short-term apartment near downtown. The collapse had begun quietly, privately, efficiently. Brooke tried to hold the image together, but the cracks were visible to anyone who knew her. Every post sounded forced, every smile strained. She was unraveling, and I watched it from the periphery, detached but not indifferent. One night, as I returned from work, the hallway outside my apartment felt heavy, like the air carried anticipation. The city's heat pressed through the concrete, thick and breathless. I unlocked the door, dropped my bag, and stared at the flash drive on my desk. Its metallic edge caught the faint glow of the streetlight, a reminder of what waited for exposure. For a moment, I imagined mailing it anonymously, letting the truth finish what it had started. But some part of me hesitated, maybe because I wasn't sure if justice still mattered, or if survival had replaced it. The thought barely settled before a sound shattered the quiet. A knock, 3 short, deliberate taps. I froze. It wasn't Jamie's rhythm. She always texted first. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the narrow apartment. My hand hovered over the flash drive, heartbeat steady but sharp. I knew who it was before I reached the door. Brooke. And whatever she wanted, peace wasn't part of it. By the time I opened the door, the apartment had already chosen sides. The humid air pressed against my skin as if it wanted to warn me. Brooke stood in the hallway, mascara smudged into shadows, the kind of mess that comes after pretending for too long. She stepped inside without permission, and I let the silence do the work voices usually claim. Her presence shook the room in small, measurable ways. The mirror caught the tremor in her hands. The floor registered the hesitation of someone who once believed she would never need to ask. I watched her look at the desk, at the flash drive placed like a verdict. A good liar studies the jury first. She had always been good at that. I did not move to comfort her. Pity has a way of rewriting history, and mine had already been edited enough. I thought about the footage, the email logs, and the quiet arithmetic of cause and effect. There was a time when I craved explanations, as if a reason could soften a wound. Now I understood that intention does not erase impact. Families can wound with purpose and still call it love. Footsteps in the hallway, then the slow turn of the knob. Jamie entered with the calm gravity of someone who knows when truth needs a witness. She set her bag down, nodded once, and the room steadied. In that small gesture, she reminded me that courage can be quiet and still count. I placed the flash drive on the table, not as a threat but as a compass. Proof, not drama. The doorbell footage lived in those pixels, the timestamp breathing certainty into every frame. The logs traced the path of the files the way tides trace a coastline patient, inevitable. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: choice, not accident. The next arrival came with the scent of cologne and exhaustion. Victor Ward entered heavier than before the accident, the kind of weight no scale records. Carol followed, spine rigid, denial wrapped around her like an old cardigan. They looked at me the way people look at a storm they hoped would turn at sea. I had nothing left to soothe them with. The story had written itself. I was just done being edited out of it. Nathan arrived last. He stood near the doorway, ringless hand in his pocket, eyes a study in resignation. The man had built a life in straight lines. Chaos had taught him to read diagonals. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His presence explained everything he refused to say aloud. There, in that crowded quiet, I aligned the pieces. I described the footage, the late-night entry, the folder held too tight. I explained the digital trail, the account credentials, the data that resisted wishful thinking. I spoke slowly and plainly, each sentence a step away from the years I spent apologizing for existing. No one interrupted. Even Brooke understood that interruption is a privilege truth rarely grants. She stared at the floor as if tiles could forgive her. Carol watched me with eyes that begged for a softer ending. Victor's hands trembled once, and I remembered being small enough to think those hands could fix anything. The shape of the moment changed when I placed the printed verification on the table: IP address logs, access times, the technical language of accountability. There was no room in those numbers for family myth. Jamie's presence made the room legitimate. Nathan's stillness made it final. I expected to feel triumphant. Vindication, at least. Instead, a steadier sensation arrived. Clarity without relief. Justice, when it comes, rarely feels like victory. It feels like standing still while the ground underneath you stops lying. Phones began to vibrate. The world found its timing. An email chimed on Carol's screen: employment action from the hospital. The termination was clinical and complete. Breach of policy, violation of confidentiality standards. Separation effective immediately. There are words that close doors without ever slamming them. This was one. Nathan's device lit next. His attorney had filed the petition he had been carrying around like a secret. The legal language was mercifully impersonal. Marriages can end without villains, but not without consequences. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and exhaled the way people do when the truth finally outpaces hope. Victor sat down. For a moment he looked at the flash drive the way a drowning man looks at a shoreline. Not a rescue, just a line that proves the ocean ends. Carol's face folded into something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Or the grief that arrives when the family photo in your mind no longer matches the one on the mantle. I kept my voice even, because evenness was the only power left that didn't resemble cruelty. I said what needed saying about boundaries, about debts that love does not erase, about the cost of choosing image over integrity. I did not ask for apologies. I did not offer absolution. Confession belongs to the guilty, healing belongs to the honest. I had learned to separate the two. When they left, the air loosened. Brooke paused at the doorway, not for forgiveness, but for the muscle memory of being believed. The silence between us held. Some distances are not measured in feet but in choices, and ours had become a coastline the tide would never cross again. After the door clicked shut, I gathered the papers, returned the flash drive to its envelope, and felt a clean, unspectacular calm. Nothing about this was sweet. Revenge, at its most precise, is not spectacle. It is refusing to wear the blame handed to you, and watching the truth do what spectacle never can. I locked the envelope away, not to bury it, but to mark the end of a chapter written without my consent. The next page would not ask who I was to them. It would ask who I chose to be without them. Morning light arrived like an apology the city didn't owe. Tampa felt quieter now, as if the scandal had drained its appetite for gossip. People moved on faster than pain did. That was the thing about truth, it made noise only until someone found a newer story to tell. Ward Logistics was officially dissolved within a month. The press release used polite language: restructuring, liquidation, closure, the legal phrasing of failure. Trucks once painted with the family logo now stood stripped, colorless, waiting to be auctioned. I didn't attend the hearings. Watching from a distance was easier than pretending I could still belong there. Brooke vanished from the internet the way guilt sometimes does without warning. Her curated world of filters and smiles disappeared overnight. No explanations. Just silence. I heard she'd left the state, maybe moved west, maybe not. It didn't matter. The universe had already given her the only mirror that tells the truth: consequence. Carol and Victor sold the house by the bay. The neighbors whispered about the quick sale, the low price, the boxes that left before dawn. My mother's garden, once perfectly symmetrical, wilted in the final weeks, weeds growing where roses had stood proud. Dad's recovery was slow, his silence slower. They moved to a small town in Georgia, away from headlines, away from me. The distance felt mutual. At work, life demanded attention again. Deadlines didn't pause for personal history. Miss Carter offered me a new role, lead designer for a coastal redevelopment project. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a test of how far I'd come without needing a family name to open doors. I said yes, not because I was ready, but because I refused to keep waiting until I was. Jamie stayed close, her presence steady as always. She never said, "I told you so," never asked how it felt to be right. Friendship, I learned, is sometimes the luxury of not needing to explain. Nights were different now. Sleep came softer. The apartment no longer felt like a place I escaped to, but one I had built. My walls held no memories that didn't belong to me. I'd stopped checking the news, stopped measuring my worth by what others lost. Survival had turned into something gentler, living without defense. Then came the letter. A plain white envelope slid under my door, addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately. Nathan Ellis, the man who had once stood quietly while a house collapsed around him. The message inside was brief, 5 sentences, no sentiment. He thanked me for the proof, said it had freed him more than he'd realized. He mentioned rebuilding, starting over, learning how to live without apology. At the end, one line lingered. Truth doesn't destroy, it only removes what was never real. I folded the paper once, placed it back into the envelope, and tucked it inside the drawer with the flash drive. Not as a keepsake, but as a record of completion. Some stories don't need replies, they just need endings. Spring crept into the city with its humid optimism. The air smelled of wet asphalt and beginnings. I walked by the bay one evening after work, the skyline reflected on the water like a promise made to no one. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look back. Freedom wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with applause or forgiveness. It came quietly, in the shape of mornings that belonged only to me. The kind where sunlight reached my window and didn't ask for permission to stay. I wasn't the daughter who left anymore. I was the woman who stayed gone and built something from the ruins she refused to inherit. The past still existed somewhere, maybe in another city, another version of me. But it no longer had my address. The season changed without ceremony. Tampa's heat folded into something gentler, as if the air itself had decided to forgive. I no longer measured time by headlines or heartbreaks. The world outside kept spinning, and for once, it didn't feel like it was spinning without me. Mornings had rhythm again. I woke before the alarm, brewed coffee that didn't taste like survival anymore. The apartment felt lived in art prints on the walls, plants that refused to die, sunlight that stayed longer than it used to. Sometimes, peace is not earned through grand gestures but through the quiet repetition of ordinary days. At the studio, work had become less about proving myself and more about creating something worth existing. Miss Carter introduced me to a curator from the Coastal Arts Council. They wanted to feature my digital photography series portraits of Tampa's forgotten corners. The invitation felt surreal, not because it was success, but because it was mine alone. No borrowed reputation, no family name attached to the signature. The night before the exhibit, I walked by the bay again. The water was calm, pretending it had never reflected chaos. I stood there thinking about how endings never arrive the way we imagine. They don't come with closure stamped in gold. They slip in quietly, disguised as the moment you stop checking who still talks about you. A week later, a familiar face appeared outside the cafe near my office, Mrs. Keene, the elderly neighbor who had lived next to my parents' house for decades. Her voice carried the same warmth I remembered from summers long gone. She mentioned hearing that my parents had settled in Georgia, that Brooke was trying to rebuild. The words didn't sting. They simply existed, like weather updates about a place I no longer lived in. I realized then that healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about changing the way it echoes. Once, their names would have broken something inside me. Now, they were just syllables belonging to another story. I didn't hate them anymore. But I didn't miss them either. Some absences are not wounds, they're clean spaces where new things can finally grow. Back at home, I opened my laptop to finalize the exhibit layout. Each photograph told a story of neglect turned beautiful, the rusted piers, abandoned lots, peeling walls kissed by rain. They weren't about revenge. They were about resilience. Maybe that's what art does, it turns damage into something you can look at without flinching. When the gallery lights dimmed for the opening night, I watched strangers pause before my work. They didn't know who I was or who I had been, and that anonymity felt holy. For the first time, I wasn't defined by survival or family or loss. I was defined by creation. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. It sounded like a rival. Later that evening, Jamie found me outside, barefoot on the steps, watching the lights reflect off parked cars. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Some friendships exist beyond language, they're made of presence, not explanation. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because perfection had stopped being the goal. I thought about Brooke's voice that day when she told me, "Better if you're gone by tomorrow." It used to haunt me. Now it felt like an unintentional blessing, the kind that hurts first and heals later. If I hadn't left, I would have stayed small enough to fit inside someone else's version of love. Leaving had been my punishment, but it became my liberation. As the night settled, I wrote a note to myself, nothing profound, just a reminder I wished I'd had years ago. You don't need closure from people who thrived on your silence. Closure comes the moment you stop waiting for it. I pinned it to the wall above my desk, between a photo of the bay and a blank canvas waiting to be filled. Life after the storm was neither grand nor cinematic. It was simple. Bills, deadlines, laughter that didn't echo guilt. Some days were dull, others quietly radiant, but all of them were mine. That was enough. Revenge had started as anger, burned through me like fire, and left behind something cleaner. Not forgiveness, clarity. I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop losing myself and proving others wrong. And so, standing beneath the soft buzz of city lights, I understood what it truly meant to let go, not to forget, but to finally remember without pain. Every ending, if you live through it long enough, stops being about what was taken and becomes about what's left. When you finally stop needing closure, that's when you've already found it. Like, subscribe, and remember, sometimes revenge is just the courage to walk away and never look back.